Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi votes in the 2025 Senate elections in Cairo as voting begins nationwide. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu affirms national unity, citing historic accomplishments and urging continued fight. Delegations meet at the UN in Geneva tomorrow to resume talks on a global plastic pollution treaty. (8 p.m. Cairo local time. The news in full with me, Halal Hamalawi. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has cast his vote in the 2025 Senate elections at a polling station in Heliopolis, Cairo, as voting kicked off across the country. The two-day election seized 424 candidates competing for 200 of the 300 Senate seats, 100 through individual races and 100 through party lists. The remaining 100 members will be appointed by the president. Polling stations opened at 9 a.m., with authorities implementing measures to ensure smooth and accessible voting nationwide. The election is organized by Egypt's National Election Authority and relevant institutions. Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli has voted in the 2025 Senate elections at the Egyptian Japanese school in Sheikh Zayed, Giza. He urged the citizens to participate, emphasizing voting as a constitutional right and national duty. Madbouli praised the government's efforts to ensure a safe and organized election and commended the National Election Authority for facilitating a transparent voting process nationwide. Ongoing voter turnout continues at 8,286 polling stations nationwide for Egypt's 2025 Senate elections, with voting open until 9 p.m. Ahmed bin Deri, the executive director of the National Election Authority, confirmed close monitoring of the election process following the day's break. The elections run on August the 4th and the 5th, featuring 428 candidates competing for 100 individual seats alongside the National for Egypt list vying for 100 proportional representation seats. About 63 million voters are registered across 8,286 polling sites, supervised by 9,500 judges, with 2,500 female judges overseeing elections outside their home districts. Election coverage is approved for 18 embassies, 9 international bodies, 58 local organizations, and 230 media outlets. Egyptians turned out in large numbers to vote in the 2025 Senate elections, with long queues reported across polling stations nationwide. Officials praised the smooth and organized process, with sunshades and accessibility measures provided for the elderly and disabled voters. Cairo, which has over 8 million eligible voters, witnessed particularly strong participation. A total of 424 candidates are contesting 200 seats, 100 through individual races and 100 through party lists, while another 100 members will be appointed by the president. The National Election Authority confirmed that over 69 million Egyptians are eligible to vote, with 25,000 local and international observers monitoring the process. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi received a phone call today from Lebanese President Joseph Aoun. The two leaders discussed ways to enhance cooperation between Egypt and Lebanon, particularly in economy, trade and investment fields. They also addressed regional developments, including the situation in Gaza, stressing the need for an immediate ceasefire, the delivery of humanitarian aid and support for the Palestinian statehood. President el-Sisi reaffirmed Egypt's unwavering support for Lebanon's sovereignty and unity and its commitment to aiding reconstruction efforts. Both leaders emphasized rejecting any violation of Lebanese sovereignty and the forced displacement of the Palestinians. Moving on to Gaza, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has affirmed the country's unity amid the ongoing war, highlighting historic accomplishments and the need to continue fighting together. He pledged to convene the cabinet soon to direct the military on defeating what he called the enemy, freeing the detainees and neutralizing Gaza's threat to Israel. Gaza's government media office has reported that since Israel eased restrictions on July 27th, only 674 aid trucks have entered Gaza, about 84 trucks daily. The aid groups say that at least 600 trucks per day are needed to meet basic humanitarian needs, meaning current deliveries cover just 14% of the required aid and fuel. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, in a phone call with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, has emphasized the urgent need for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, increased humanitarian aid and the release of the detainees. He called for Israel's full withdrawal from Gaza and reiterated the Palestinian Authority's readiness to assume full responsibility in the Strip. Abbas also stressed halting West Bank settlement expansion, settler violence and attacks on holy sites, while praising Australia's humanitarian aid to Gaza and its support for the two-state solution. Both leaders agreed to meet on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September to strengthen bilateral ties and advance peace efforts. More than a dozen former Israeli security chiefs, including leaders from the Mossad, Shin Bet, and the military, have publicly called for an end to the war on Gaza. They argue that the conflict has yielded limited military access, failed to secure the release of the detainees, and caused serious damage to Israel's reputation. Warning that the war lacks clear political goals, they say that it risks Israel's security and identity and is edging towards defeat. The Palestine Red Crescent Society, PRCS, has reported that Israeli occupation forces killed 2 Palestinians and injured 11 others while they waited for humanitarian aid in central Gaza's Netzarim corridor, a heavily militarized zone. Footage shows paramedics treating the wounded and recovering bodies. The day before, an Israeli attack on the PRCS headquarters in Khan Yunis killed 1 team member and injured 2 others. A coalition of over 60 Jewish and Arab peace groups has set up a protest camp in Tel Aviv demanding an end to the war in Gaza and the release of Israeli detainees, organized by the It's Time coalition. The encampment marks 667 days since the conflict began and will remain indefinitely. The coalition condemns the ongoing war as politically driven and highlights the severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza. At least 38 people have died within 24 hours at Gaza's Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis amid ongoing bombardment and displacement. The hospital treated hundreds of patients, with 581 in the emergency room and 741 in outpatient care. Staff face severe shortages of supplies, overcrowded wards, and limited specialist access, straining Gaza's collapsing health system. Save the Children has warned that Gaza faces a catastrophic hunger crisis, especially for children living under constant threat and lacking basic supplies. Ahmed El-Hindawi, the group's Middle East director, stressed the urgent need for sustained food and medical aid to reverse months of blockade-induced starvation. He urged Israel to remove all the barriers to humanitarian access, highlighting that some damage to children's health may already be irreversible. Over a dozen Democratic U.S. lawmakers are urging the Trump administration to recognize a Palestinian state amid the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Axios reported the letter, led by Representative Ro Khanna and signed by several others, calls for acknowledgement of Palestinian self-determination. This push follows recent shifts in UK, France, and Canada's stances on Palestinian statehood. The Palestinian Center for Prisoners Defense has reported that Israel is detaining 24 doctors from Gaza under harsh conditions. Since October 2023, over 400 medical workers have been arrested, with most released without charge. Human rights groups say that the detained medical staff face torture and systematic humiliation in Israeli custody. Right, 26. Australia has pledged 20 million Australian dollars, about 13 million US dollars in new aid to support humanitarian efforts in Gaza, including food and medical supplies. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade said that the move follows the announcement of new humanitarian corridors. The Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, reiterated Australia's call for Israel to fully resume aid access, stressing that the suffering and starvation of civilians in Gaza must end. Medical sources in Gaza have reported 5 more adult deaths from starvation and malnutrition in the past 24 hours, bringing the total to 180, including 93 children. Since the war began on October the 7th, 2023, over 209,000 people have been killed or wounded, according to Gaza health authorities, with thousands still missing and widespread displacement continuing. UNRWA warned that malnutrition among children under 5 has doubled since March, while the WHO says that nearly 1 in 5 young children in Gaza City now suffers from acute malnutrition. The UN Human Rights Office in the occupied Palestinian territory has expressed deep shock over continued attacks on emergency workers in Gaza. In a post on X, the office condemned an Israeli strike on a Palestinian Red Crescent Society (PRCS) facility on August the 3rd, which killed one worker and injured at least 3 others. The office reported that 49 PRCS and 136 civil defense members have been killed so far, despite their critical life-saving roles amid the ongoing conflict. It called for an independent investigation into all civilian deaths, warning that deliberate attacks on humanitarian personnel could continue war crimes. Medical sources in Gaza have reported a surge in cases of acute flaccid paralysis and Guillain-Barré syndrome among children, driven by atypical infections and severe malnutrition. At least 3 children have died from Guillain-Barré, with 2 under the age of 15. Doctors say that intestinal viruses unrelated to polio are spreading in unsanitary, overcrowded conditions, creating a fertile environment for disease outbreaks. The deaths, they warn, signal a looming infections disaster, made worse by the lack of medical supplies under the blockade restrictions. The World Health Organization is set to deliver trucks carrying blood units and essential medical supplies to hospitals across the Gaza Strip today. While the aid does not include food, it's urgently needed to support life-saving care for the wounded and chronically ill. The delivery follows a successful shipment of medications and supplies 2 days ago, as the WHO continues efforts to support Gaza's overwhelmed health system. The Arab Parliament has strongly condemned the storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli settlers, including extremist Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, under the protection of Israeli forces. The incursion, which included provocative rituals and dances, was labeled a blatant violation of the legal and historical status of Jerusalem and a dangerous provocation to Muslims worldwide. In a statement, the parliament said that such acts are part of a systematic policy of ethnic cleansing and religious escalation, linking them to ongoing atrocities in Gaza and forced displacement in the West Bank. Holding Israel fully responsible for the escalation, the Arab Parliament urged international intervention to halt violations and protect Palestinian people and holy sites. U.S. envoy to Syria, Tom Barak, described the recent events in Suwayda and Manbiji on Sunday as concerning. In a post on X, he stated that diplomacy remains the best path to ending violence and achieving a peaceful, lasting solution. He expressed pride in the United States' cooperation to help mediate a resolution in Suwayda, as well as its joint efforts with France to facilitate the reintegration of northeastern Syria into a unified Syria. The Syrian Democratic Forces announced that they clashed with factions affiliated with the new Syrian government forces in the Deir Hafer area of Aleppo countryside. The SDF stated that government-affiliated forces launched attacks on 4 of its positions in the region. US-backed Kurdish-led group added that its forces exercised their right to respond to the attack and took the necessary action in defense of their positions and fighters. Syrian media reported that authorities have reopened the Busra Sham humanitarian corridor in Suwayda province, southern Syria, after securing the area and removing the threat posed by rebel groups. Ahmad Ad-Dalati, head of the internal security forces in Suwayda, stated that armed groups attacked areas in the countryside of the southern province on Sunday, resulting in deaths and injuries. Security forces later regained control of the area. The Turkish presidential office confirmed that there is no information regarding any upcoming military agreement between Turkey and Syria or plans to establish military bases there. This statement came in response to a report by Adunik newspaper, which claimed that Turkey and Syria would sign a military cooperation agreement by the end of August. The report stated that Ankara would assist in forming a new Syrian army and training military personnel. The newspaper also alleged that Turkey plans to establish 3 military bases within the Syrian Arab Republic.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين. وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Lebanese President Joseph Aoun stated that uncovering the full truth about the Beirut port explosion is an obligation for the Lebanese state and all its institutions, regardless of the obstacles or the ranks involved. He emphasized that justice makes no exceptions and that the law applies to everyone without discrimination. Aoun made these remarks during a speech commemorating the 5th anniversary of the Beirut port explosion, which occurred on August 4, 2020, resulting in the deaths of more than 220 people, thousands of injuries, and dozens still missing. The Israeli newspaper Ma'arif published a report highlighting the parallels between what Israeli soldiers experienced in southern Lebanon during the security zone era before the 2000 withdrawal and what Israel is currently facing in the ongoing war on Gaza. Ma'arif argues that the scene is repeating itself. Israel then and now found itself in a military quagmire, a volatile fight in the mud with a political leadership unable to make clear strategic decisions. The paper noted that the cost Israel paid for remaining in southern Lebanon and even afterwards up to the current Operation Iron Swords was steep, as years of prolonged war eroded public trust in the Israeli army. To Russia, where the Kremlin has said that Russian President Vladimir Putin may meet with U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff this week. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that Moscow is always happy to receive Witkoff and values the ongoing contacts as important and very useful. Peskov praised U.S. mediation efforts aimed at resolving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, emphasizing a preference for political and diplomatic solutions. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump said on Sunday that Witkoff might visit Russia midweek, but warned that sanctions would be imposed if Moscow does not agree to a ceasefire before Friday. The Kremlin has urged caution over nuclear rhetoric following U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement that he ordered the repositioning of nuclear submarines. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that it was clear that American submarines are already on combat duty as a standard procedure and downplayed the significance of Trump's comments. Peskov stressed that Russia maintains a responsible stance on nuclear issues and expressed no desire to engage in a public debate over the matter. He reiterated that there can be no winner in a nuclear war and emphasized the complexity and sensitivity surrounding these discussions. South Korea began dismantling speakers broadcasting anti-North Korea messages along the border. The Defense Ministry said that President Lee Jae-myung's government seeks to reduce tensions with Pyongyang. The broadcasts were switched off shortly after Lee took office in June, part of efforts to restart stalled dialogue. However, North Korea has dismissed Seoul's outreach, saying that it has no interest in talks.
북한과의 사전 협의는 없었습니다.
On U.S. tariff policy, President Donald Trump has said that he will substantially raise tariffs on India, citing the country's continued purchases of Russian oil. In a post on Truth Social, Trump accused India of buying massive amounts of Russian oil and then reselling it for big profits. The president's post linked the purchases to the conflict in Ukraine, stating that India don't care how many people in Ukraine are being killed. The move marks a significant escalation in trade tensions between the two nations. The European Commission spokesperson has announced that the European Union will suspend its two packages of countermeasures to U.S. tariffs for 6 months. The decision follows a trade deal with U.S. President Donald Trump, averting a potential trade war. While the agreement leaves many questions unresolved, including tariff rates on spirits and car parts, the EU said that it is working to finalize a joint statement and is committed to using the 6-month period to secure a new deal. Global stock markets were mostly positive on Monday, with European and U.S. futures advancing as investors weighed new economic data. In the U.S., the S&P 500 futures rose 1.18%, Nasdaq futures increased 1.51%, and Dow Jones Industrial Average futures gained 1.10%. Across Europe, the UK's FTSE 100 gained 0.62%. Germany's DAX advanced 1.36%, and France's CAC 40 surged 1.09%. In Asia, the Shanghai Composite rose 0.66%, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index gained 0.92%, while Japan's Nikkei 225 slid 1.25%. Oil prices fell to their lowest in a week on Monday after OPEC Plus agreed to another large output increase in September, though traders remained wary of further sanctions on Russia. Brent crude futures fell 2.2% to $68.12 a barrel, their lowest since July the 23rd, while U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude declined by nearly 2.6% to $65.61. Both contracts lost about $2 on Friday. Gold prices rose for a third straight session on Monday after last week's economic data fueled expectations of interest rate cuts by the U.S. Federal Reserve. Spot gold rose 0.3% to $3,373.22 per ounce, its highest level since July the 24th. U.S. gold futures gained 0.8% to $3,427.10. Delegations will meet at the UN in Geneva starting tomorrow to resume talks on a global treaty to reduce plastic pollution. Key issues include capping plastic production, managing harmful chemicals, and financing support for developing countries. However, oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia and Russia are expected to challenge key provisions favoring voluntary measures over legally binding rules. The U.S. aims to limit the treaty's scope to waste management and recycling, avoiding strict restrictions on producers. Experts warn urgent action is needed as plastics pollute ecosystems worldwide and pose serious health risks. More than 600 people have visited a dog-friendly water park near Barcelona as Spain faced its second heat wave of the summer. The state meteorological agency confirmed temperatures soaring between 40 and 42 degrees Celsius across much of the country. Located about 30 kilometers from Barcelona, the park offers dogs 2 pools to swim in, slides to zoom down, and even dog-friendly ice cream. Visitors enjoy the chance to cool off and have fun with their pets during the scorching heat. And this brings us to the end of our news bulletin, and here is what we have been covering. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi votes in the 2025 Senate elections in Cairo as voting begins nationwide. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu affirms national unity, citing historic accomplishments and urging continued fight. Delegations meet at the UN in Geneva tomorrow to resume talks on a global plastic pollution treaty. And this concludes our news bulletin for the hour. Don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at QNewsEG to stay informed. I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.